Today, like I said, I'm going to move on to talk about World War I, which I'll, of course, be talking about the whole week today and later, maybe on Wednesday. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about the beginning of the war, like some of the causes of World War I that happened. I'll kind of get into the outbreak of the war, and I'll probably at least go up to like maybe around 1916, kind of the middle part of the war. So, anyway, World War I, if you know much about it, started in 1914. It would last, by the way, over 4 years. Starts about maybe around August 1914, ended November 1918. And so, yeah, it is considered one of the first of the two world wars that happened, of course, in the 20th century. World War I, of course, 1914 to 1918. World War II was 1939 to 1945. Both were very bloody. If you know about those two wars, really the two bloodiest wars really in human history, ever. World War I think the amount of soldier deaths was somewhere around 9-10 million. I think the World War II, it was like 20-30 million or more that were killed soldiers in the war. And then civilian deaths, of course, you want to add that to even more as well. Now, the war has different names. Of course, originally they didn't call it World War I. If you know about this, originally the name was called the Great War. That was the war that everybody fought. They called it because the fact it was considered one of the greatest world wars in history at that point in history. It was considered the war to end all wars because I guess people thought that there weren't going to be really any other bigger wars after that. Maybe even there would be no more warfare, which is really a joke because World War I in itself helped to really cause the other wars later. Like World War I, they think caused World War II. A lot of the weaponry used in World War I were later used, of course, in World War II and other wars. And so it's the war that really started all these other wars that we have in modern times, of course, after that. Now, there were different causes of why World War I broke out, which a lot of them you see there in that list is a lot. Now, a lot of them were a combination of like long-term causes. And then there was, of course, short-term causes as well, which I'll get to later, which is the whole, Archduke, being assassinated. I'll get to that later. But one of the major causes, of course, of World War I was really the rivalries of the powers in Europe, sometimes called the so-called great powers. They were called France, Britain, Germany were the main ones, I guess, that were antagonists that kind of started the war. Italy was involved, Austria-Hungary, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as they called it as well, Russian Empire as well. And then they also throw in the Ottoman Empire too, as well, the Turks. They, like one of their last conflicts they're in before they break up. And so that's definitely, some of the major causes of why World War I broke out. But you kind of blow this up here, you can see that the different things that caused World War I, the nationalism, which we've talked about before, of course, in that previous lecture last week on 19th century Europe, part 3. So yeah, nationalism, like the unification of a lot of different countries, helped cause it. New imperialism, because that helped spawn a lot of conflicts like Africa, Asia, Pacific, etc. Militarism, you have this arms race between the different powers before the war broke out, where both sides were stockpiling, different kinds of weaponry before the war. Entanglements with the alliances. You have this alliance systems that kind of oppose each other in Europe, which helps kind of cause a so-called chain reaction war, which you kind of saw at the end of that video, where just kind of everybody started fighting each other and kind of blows up. And so those are major causes of why, of course, the war broke out. But obviously, yeah, nationalism is often deemed as really one of the main causes of why, really World War I broke out. And they think even World War II, like, with the fascists and all that, there were extreme nationalism and so on. They think those are major causes of why it happened. And then you had all those unifications we talked about before: German unification, Italian unification, Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy and things like that. They were kind of in Europe, and really the state that helped. They think a lot of people kind of blame later for really why World War One would break out would be Germany. They think Germany is the one that really offset the whole balance of power when their empire formed in 1871. And so their aggressiveness after that, like in world affairs and things like that, in Africa, etc., that really helps to really spawn the war eventually. So, and then of course, like I said, new imperialism, had a lot to do with it, because of the fact you have all these European powers that are in Africa and other parts of the world, that helps to foster even more rivalries. And then when World War One broke out, you got these different colonists and people fighting each other, like in Africa. So like the Germans were fighting the French, the British, and others that were in Africa that were already there. And so that kind of helps to expand the war in general throughout the globe. And then, of course, there's other causes, like they always talk about, like I said, militarism. Yeah, there was an arms race that occurred before the war, which really made, the war very bloody. They think a lot of it was caused by the Industrial Revolution, the fact that the Industrial Revolution helped to create new kinds of inventions that helped transform warfare to be more modernized, but also, very deadly. So, before the war, both sides were stockpiling new kinds of weaponry, new kinds of naval ships. Like the Germans started to try and, build like these battleships that were called dreadnoughts, if you know about that, in Europe at the time. That I think in the middle and the bottom there, that picture there is a dreadnought, of course, battleship, which the British first started building these steel hull, battleships, and then the Germans tried to counter them. Also submarines as well, but new kinds of weaponry, tanks, you see on the bottom left there, airplanes, of course, being developed in the war on the bottom right, different kinds of artillery that were advanced, like the Germans had the so-called Big Bertha artillery that was well known in the war, machine guns, also tanks, I just talked about, poison gas, submarines, all those kinds of new kinds of forms of warfare were things that they started to use in the war that really advanced it and made it, very bloody. I think the Germans had used Zeppelins, about that in the war. And some of these machine guns could fire up to several hundred bullets per minute. But they seem to think that the biggest killer of really, I guess, World War I soldiers in the war was probably artillery. That's what really killed a lot of soldiers, and that disease overall. Yeah, different kinds of chemical weapons were used, like mustard gas was very famous. I think chlorine gas was also used as well, and things like that. Of course, the other thing like I just talked about earlier was the so-called, rival alliance systems. That's the number 4 that they think helped to cause, of course, World War I, which was a chain reaction war that eventually broke out. And you had these 2 different alliances that eventually opposed each other before the war. You had the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, and the ones in the middle were part of the so-called Triple Alliance, which included the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, which originally founded in 1882. They think this was actually caused because of what happened back to the Franco-Prussian War that broke out between France and Prussia. And later it was known as the Central Powers. That's what they called it during the war, because other powers joined it. In Italy, eventually, when the war broke out in 1914, refused to back Germany and Austria-Hungary. They stayed neutral and later switched to the Allied side in the war. And they were later replaced by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. Those were the main powers that were really as part of the Central Powers that were there. But Germany was really the most powerful state that was in the Central Powers overall. And then opposing them was another alliance that they called the Triple Entente, which was later called the Allies or Allied powers during World War I. and originally included France, Russia, and Britain. It started out as this Franco-Russian alliance, and then the British joined it as well by 1907. And then during World War One, because there were more than three powers in it, they call it the Allies or Allied powers. And then it had other powers in it, like Serbia, Romania, Italy. The United States joined it in 1917. Japan, I think Greece was in it, and I think at one point maybe I think Portugal may have joined too later in the war as well. And so that's basically one of the other big calls, of course, of World War One. So here's another map showing you the different powers that were in the war. But you can see the areas that are kind of in tan are Central Powers, and then the green areas are, of course, the Allied powers. Now, of course, the other thing they always talk about, obviously with the whole outbreak of World War One, is the fifth, I guess, cause of the war, which is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who, by the way, was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, who happened to be the nephew of Franz Joseph I, who was the emperor, of course, of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And, of course, he was assassinated on June 28th, 1914, city of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Bosnia had been, by the way, absorbed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1908. That's kind of a dramatized painting, I guess, of the actual assassination that you're looking at. And there was apparently this terrorist organization that was behind it. I kind of want to get into. There's Franz Ferdinand that you're looking at right there, who, by the way, he was kind of controversial because he had married this woman named Countess, or her name was Countess Sophie, but Sophie Chodik, I believe was her name, who was from the lower class. She was from a lower station, and it was called a morganatic marriage. I think when you marry somebody of lower status, that was kind of controversial, and was prevented him, I think, from maybe getting the throne or something like that. But part of why he got shot was he wanted to go to Sarajevo and do this state visit there because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doing troop exercises near Serbia. And anyway, there was this terrorist organization that was called the Black Hand. It was a secret military organization in Serbia based in Belgrade. And these Slavic nationalists that were there wanted to use terror tactics to hopefully create a Slavic state in that part of the world, the Balkans, which they later referred to after World War I as being called Yugoslavia. And so they thought that if they killed the Archduke, that would help lead to it, which I guess they kind of did later, of course, after the war. And there was a man you see there named Dragutin Dmitrievich, the top left there. He was a colonel in Serbian military intelligence, and he was believed to be the one that was behind it, like organized the assassination. And he ended up sending like 7 assassins to try and kill the Archduke on June 28th, 1914. He had a nickname, by the way, which was Apis, which I think it means the bull, because I guess he looks like a bull with his mustache, I guess. And kind of talk about the Balkans. In Europe, there had been this theory that the Balkans area, you see there, might cause a big war to break out eventually. And so the Balkans was often referred to as being called the powder keg of Europe. Serbia was this nationalist state that broke away from the Ottoman Empire. The Serbians, a lot of them wanted to include like Bosnia, Croatia, and other areas as a Yugoslavia. They're hoping to kind of break away, form their state away from Austria-Hungary that was nearby. And so, yeah, a lot of these multi-ethnic peoples that were there that didn't want to be under those empires. So I think that was part of the cause of, why it broke out, because of Slavic nationalism throughout the Balkans at the time. There, of course, is the Archduke and his wife touring Sarajevo, which, as you saw in the video, it was basically this convertible that they toured basically the city right there. There's the actual death car, if you want to call it that, 1911 Grafenstift double Phaeton convertible. That's the one that they got shot in, of course. It's kind of comparable almost to the Kennedy assassination, in November 1963. It's kind of weird about that. I guess nobody thought that he might walk up and shoot him, that kind of thing. Anyway, there were actually 2 attempts on his life, which I did want to talk. I'll kind of get to Gavrilo Princip in a second, who's the actual main assassin that would kill the Archduke. But actually, this other man they talked about in a little video named Nejelko Kaparnovich, he actually was one of the 7 assassins, and he threw a bomb at the motorcade as it was going through the city of Sarajevo. I think it bounced off the car, blew up in the street, injuring some people. But it failed basically to kill the Archduke. And Kaparnovich and Princip were part of this National Slavic group that was called the Young Bosnia, where they wanted to take Bosnia and break it off from Austria-Hungary and add it to like Yugoslavia, like a Yugoslavian state. And so he's actually caught afterwards and captured. And then from there, you can see that Archduke and them went to the they went to the see the mayor of Sarajevo, and I think he said something like, "Mr. Mayor, I came here on a visit, and I get bombs thrown at me. It's outrageous," I think was the famous quote that he said. And so they decided to get back in the vehicle, and they were going to go and visit, of course, the wounded that had got hurt from the bomb. And apparently that's when the other attempt happened against them, of course, where this other man, Gavrilo Princip, who was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb student, basically, I think he was drinking something or eating something in a cafe, walked out and saw the car of the Archduke backing up, because I think they had gone down like a wrong street, that wrong turn, like they said. And so he walked up to him and shot them both in the car. And he actually shot his wife first by accident. He didn't mean to shoot her, but he shot basically his wife, and then shot the Archduke, and both died within, I think, less than an hour right afterwards. And that may be the picture they think of Princip being arrested. I think that's been debated about that. That's whether him or maybe a suspect that was arrested, but he was arrested afterwards and eventually charged with it. But Princip, by the way, was too young to get the death penalty, because he was like 19, and a bunch of the actual assassins that were involved, of course, ended up in prison. And Princip ended up dying in prison during the war, I think of tuberculosis, something like that, I believe. So that was how the thing really begins at that point with the war. And what's going to happen is Austria is going to declare war on Serbia at this point, Austria-Hungary. You can see here, I kind of blow this up, but it basically, they think that the assassination upset Austria-Hungary so much. Basically their heir to the throne gets killed at that point, and they send an ultimatum to Serbia to turn over all the assassins that were, the people that were kind of involved in Serbia, like I guess Demetrius, that colonel that was involved. They wanted to arrest him. I think they had him killed, but they're pretty angry about it, and I think they were pretty much just didn't really care at that point. And so what happens a few days later with Germany having, backing Austria-Hungary, I think the Germans say they'll just give them a blank check. They want to go ahead and attack Serbia. And so July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. And so that little short part of the war, beginning of the war at that point, is really what's going to help to blow up World War I. It's going to be considered the beginning of the war, the First World War. And what's really going to cause the whole thing really to blow up afterwards is the fact that you get this crisis that happens in Europe afterwards, called the July crisis, that happened late July. Like happens, I think, starting from, I want to say July 28th to July 31st. What happens is Germany and Russia decide to mobilize their forces. The Germans back Austria-Hungary because, they're in this triple alliance together. And then the Russians mobilize to help Serbia because Serbia's got a lot of people that are Orthodox Christians, like in Russia. Both are also have a lot of Slavs, as well. And so that's basically why those two sides, start mobilizing their forces, and eventually everybody does. Like in Europe, start to mobilize in Europe and fight the war. So yeah, full mobilization really starts going at the end of July, and there's really nothing that the monarchs could even do to stop it. I think Nicholas II even tried to send telegrams to his cousin, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, but it was just too late. Both sides started mobilizing their forces, and eventually Germany decides to really get in the war, and so they declare war on Russia and then France and also Belgium, and then the British respond by declaring war also on the Germans. The next thing you know, the war explodes, throughout Europe at that point. So I think from August 1st to really August 4th, that's the dates really when the war really breaks out, because Germany declares war on Russia first, which I believe is August 1st, France on August 3rd, Belgium on August 4th, and Britain responds by declaring war on Germany on August 5th. So kind of a chain reaction right there, breaking out with war, of course, occurring. And so that's, you get the so-called different powers that really respond. The only power that really decides not to really get involved is Italy. They at first stayed neutral in the war and don't back either side. Then I think by 1916, they switched to the Allied side and fight. Then the Ottoman Empire, along with Bulgaria, will come in too. They'll back the Central Power side with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So you'll see that happen later as well. Now, the Germans were very concerned that they were going to have to fight a two-front war. And so for years, the Germans had been working on this military plan that was called the Schlieffen Plan, which was named after General Alfred von Schlieffen, who was one of the chiefs of staff of the German army. And it was basically created to prevent a two-front war from really, breaking out from both sides. And so they basically implemented this plan at the beginning of the war. How the plan was supposed to work was that they were going to try to concentrate the majority of their forces on the Western Front to try and defeat France first, because France was the bigger power than Russia was, and they were closer to Germany. And so they thought they could try to take out the French first by invading through northern France, mostly take their industries in the north, and then they would use like railroads or whatever to attack Russia in the east, to defeat Russia later. And that was the whole point of what the Schlieffen Plan was about. They thought the Russians would take a longer time to mobilize. However, the plan didn't exactly work like they thought it would, because Britain came into the war. Russia mobilized faster than they thought they would. And then the Germans had trouble supplying their forces as they invaded into the north. And so the Schlieffen Plan ends up not really working. But you can see here, that's the actual invasion. The German forces invade through Belgium, Luxembourg, and also through Alsace-Lorraine, Western Germany, into northern France. The British send forces into northern France. Belgium, they think, fell first. Belgium falls on August 21st. They didn't really put up much of a fight. The Belgians didn't really have much of a military compared to the Germans. They're occupied throughout most of the war. And then the British send forces under the British Expeditionary Force. So they fight alongside the French forces at that point. And when the Germans advance into northern France, this causes a major battle to break out, which was called the First Battle of the Marne, which was fought between about maybe around September 6th to the 12th is the peak of the First Battle of Marne. There's two battles of the Marne in World War One. There's another one in 1918. That's later. The First Battle of the Marne, if you know much about it, is considered to be really one of the first major bloody battles of World War One. If you know much about the Battle of Marne, it was one of the largest battles in history so far at that point. The French fielded like 6 armies along with the British army against the Germans. And it involved something like 2 million troops combined. It was the largest battle since the Battle of Leipzig or the Battle of Nations, when you remember correctly, when they defeated Napoleon in northern Germany, where they had like 600,000 troops that were fighting. So this was like 4 times that, the amount of troops. The amount of casualties were, I think, almost equal to the Battle of Leipzig, to give you an idea how bloody these battles are later in World War One. And I'll get to it in a second, but there's that general that's kind of in the middle right there. That's General Joseph Joffre right there. That's a famous general in World War One. He's kind of on the left there in that picture. And he has a counterattack that he pushes back, which helps stall the whole German drive, of course, in the war. And it's going to eventually lead to what's really the Western Front forming afterwards in 1914, which ends up being one of the bloodiest fronts really in World War One. And you can see that map there. The Allies are able to push the Germans back close to where the Aisne River is, kind of like from the North Sea down to where Lorraine is, Alsace-Lorraine down here on the bottom right. And that leads to a thing that's called the Race to the Sea, where both powers begin to dig trenches up and down the line from Belgium to almost Switzerland at that point. And so it's going to lead to this defensive war that's going to form in northern France. And it's going to create a big stalemate for a few years right there. And the Western Front was really one of the bloodiest fronts in World War One. The amount of casualties in World War One on the Western Front was maybe close to about 13 million that are killed in a period of like around 4 years. That's a lot of people. So that's a good chunk of the amount of casualties. That includes like killed and wounded in the war, and I guess those that also died from disease as well. The second bloodiest front was probably the Eastern Front, which I'll also talk about today as well. But neither side will be able to break through because of the use of trench warfare and also all the new kinds of weaponry that they use, like machine guns, artillery, etc. So yeah, trench warfare, that's one of the things that's very famous about World War One. World War One was more of a defensive type war compared to World War II, where World War II was more offensive battles. It was probably why it was more bloodier, World War II compared to the other first war. And kind of show you a map of Europe and all the different fronts that were, of course, fought in World War One. Of course, so you can see up there in northern France, you can see, pretty much the Western Front right there that's fought. The other front, which you can see going into that purple area, like in Russia, in the central part of the map there, the Eastern Front was really the most successful front that the Central Powers in Germany really fought in the war. In fact, Germany would drive back the Russian forces into the Ukraine. They even would take control of the northern Black Sea and the Crimea, as like there, Ukraine will be actually occupied by the Germans. They occupied World War II as well, during World War, on the so-called Eastern Front in World War II. And I'll get to it later, but Russia's defeats in the war, which was a lot of high casualties, by the way. Russia suffered a lot of casualties in World War One. It's going to eventually cause the so-called Russian Revolution to break out in February of 1917, and that's going to lead to Tsar Nicholas II eventually abdicating his throne. The Romanov dynasty and the empire comes to an end at that point. And then I'll get to it later. The Bolsheviks will eventually seize power. And you'll have the Soviet Union form, of course, later. In northern Italy, you see that like right next to Switzerland there. They also had the so-called Italian front, which some of the Italians also call it the Alpine front because they were fighting up in the mountains and in forests of northern Italy. And that was a conflict where Italy came into the war in 1916, and they fought Austria-Hungary in that war. Italy wanted to expand Italy northward into Austro-Hungarian territory and seize more of the Adriatic Sea there. And so that's why they entered the war eventually on the Allied side. In fact, Austria-Hungary had to fight multiple fronts. They fought Italy, they fought Serbia, and they were also having to fight Russia, which was part of why their empire collapsed later. And the Italians in Austria-Hungary suffered like over 4 million casualties, like killed and wounded in the war. Battle of Caporetto in 1917 was actually an Austro-Hungarian victory, but Battle of Vittorio Veneto really was the most famous battle fought really in World War I, where the Italians defeated the Austro-Hungarian forces, and that helped to force them to capitulate at the end of the war. And so, yeah, Italy won that war. They were kind of on the winning side in the war. Will be later be one of the powers that'll be at the Paris Peace Conference. They also had the Balkans campaign. I don't know if you see that down there where it says Serbia. Yeah, Serbia, Austro-Hungary fought Serbia. In fact, Serbia got invaded by Austro-Hungarian armies, but they didn't do well. If you know about this, the Serbians actually put up a fight with backing from the Allies, and eventually they were rebuffed. They were pushed back up the Balkans Peninsula, and so Austro-Hungarian Empire did not fare well fighting Italy or Serbia in the war. I think they did better fighting against the Russians and all that. They also had the Middle Eastern theater. The British allies in basically Britain, French forces, also had the Anzacs, which were Australian New Zealander corps, fought with the Arabs against the Ottoman Empire. They fought all over the place. In Turkey, they fought like in Jordan, around Israel and Palestine as well. And I think around Iran, Iraq, they were fighting their forces. And that's part of why the Ottoman Empire would collapse later, because they end up losing the war. And after the war, the Ottoman Empire, of course, broke up. The Middle Eastern front, if you know about that, is very famous for T.E. Lawrence. You may have heard of him, known as Lawrence of Arabia. He, of course, aided the Arab forces in the war. He was this British officer that became very, very famous in the war. That was known for, wearing Arab garb, and they later made movies about him. Like the most famous was in 1962, the famous movie called Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole, Omar Sharif. You may have seen that before. And so he kind of was romanticized, but Arab nationalism was a big thing that kind of erupted, of course, afterwards. I can't really see it, but there was an African front. The Germans, who were outnumbered, had to fight different powers like Britain, France, the Portuguese, Italy, Belgium, in East Africa, West Africa. And so they actually fared well because I think they had decent generals down there. But eventually the Germans lose their colonies in Africa because of their losing World War I later. Then in the Atlantic Ocean, don't forget, the Germans used submarines like U-boats to attack Allied shipping. That really helped to kind of hurt the Allies in the war. But they do think that the sinking of like Allied ships like the Lusitania in May of 1915 helped to cause the United States to back the Allies in the war against Germany. And so German unrestricted submarine warfare was another major cause of why the United States would enter the war, which is later in 1917. If you study about World War One, a lot of the soldiers had different nicknames. They were called. I sometimes usually talk about this, and about World War One. A lot of the German soldiers, which you see on the left, were often called the Huns. If they started comparing the invasion of France and all that to, Attila the Hun, who invaded part of the Roman Empire at the end of the ancient times. So they kind of use that name. A lot of the Germans were also called Fritz because a lot of Germans were named Frederick, which the German nickname for Frederick is Fritz. Like Frederick the Great, old Fritz, and so they use that name too as well. They're also called Kraut. You might have heard that term being used, Kraut, which they're called Kraut because of the fact that a lot of Germans would eat sauerkraut, with sausage. So they're called that. And I think La Boche is kind of a similar to that name, Kraut, the French variation of it, which because the fact that they ate sauerkraut, La Boche is a variation of the word saying the cabbage head or cabbage, I think they're called because of the sauerkraut. The French soldiers, I think it might be in one in the middle, maybe there, but the French soldiers were called Pelou, which meant the hairy ones, because a lot of times they wouldn't shave. And then sometimes a lot of the British would call the French soldiers, if you know about this in World War I and World War II, they called the frog, French frog, because the fact that some of the French ate things like frogs and snails, and so that's what I called that. And I think that might be a British soldier, like the Tommy. The Tommy soldier is a nickname that came from the fact that one of the first soldiers to enlist in Britain at the beginning of the war was named Tommy Atkins, and Tommy or Thomas was a common name on a lot of British soldiers, and so the name Tommy became kind of a nickname they called a lot of the British soldiers. American soldiers later in the war, when they joined in 1917, of course, were called Yanks, like Yankee, which a lot of the British called the Americans, but a lot of the American soldiers were also called doughboys, which there's been a big debate about why American soldiers were called doughboys. Some claim it's because of the buttons on their jackets look like their uniforms look like a donut. Another theory is that they ate like bread all the time, made from dough, so doughboy as well. Italian soldiers are sometimes called macaroni. I don't know if you heard of that, because Italians ate pasta, and I guess when Americans went there later, and they ate pasta. What's that? That kind. They haven't seen that before. I guess pasta. So macaroni. Australians were called Aussie. New Zealanders were called Kiwi. They hear that term being used. And the so-called Anzac forces, if you know about this, which were the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, they fought alongside the British Empire in World War I. And it was really their first conflict. They'd never fought it before. A bunch of, there's still like close to, I want to say, 60, 70,000 joined up to fight for the British Empire in the war. A lot of them also fought later in World War II in the Pacific. Now I'm going to talk about some early campaigns today that were kind of, famous in World War I. There was one campaign that was called the Gallipoli Campaign, or it's also called sometimes the Dardanelles Campaign, which mostly occurred at the beginning of the war. Happened between 1915 to 1916. This conflict. And it was a campaign that was fought between the Allied side, which the British were most of the ones involved, along with various allies, like the French, Anzacs were also involved. They fought against the Ottoman Empire in this attempt to take what they call the Gallipoli Peninsula that was in Western Turkey. And part of why this happened was because of the fact that what happened was the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers at the beginning of the war in 1914. And so that blockaded the Black Sea, which was a big problem for the Russians because now the Russians couldn't get supplies up to them through the Black Sea. And so they needed military aid. And so the main goal of the British in the Gallipoli campaign was to seize that peninsula, drive up it, take the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which was Istanbul, which a lot of the West still called Constantinople. And it was the brainchild actually of Winston Churchill, who was not prime minister at the time. He was in the government, I think he was in the naval part of the government. And First Lord of the Admiralty, I think was his title or something like that. He was the guy that was the brainchild behind it and thought they could do this. And so what they did was they brought naval forces up through the Aegean Sea. And the British were commanded by this general named Ian Hamilton, who brought up most of the bulk of the forces that were British, which you can see about 350,000 were involved. French had about 80,000 troops that were involved. And then the Anzacs, which were, I told you, the Australian New Zealander forces, they put up about 65,000 troops as well. This was a very bloody conflict, by the way. If you know what happened, a lot of the fierce fighting, of course, on Gallipoli led to a lot of casualties. Britain having, of course, the most, of course, in the war. But New Zealand and Australia, they suffered like over 50% of their forces were actually wounded in the campaign. And if you go back to this map right here, the forces mostly tried to attack the western part of the peninsula, like the tip of it and part of the western part of it right there. And the two bloodiest battles they fought were the Battle of Anzac Bay and also the Battle of Gallipoli, which were fought mostly around April when it broke out. And the Allies were able to form a beachhead, but they couldn't push inward. That was the only thing. They couldn't push up the peninsula. And the Turks basically battered their forces. And both sides suffered a lot of I think the total casualties at Gallipoli was over 250,000, like all the different allies that were involved in it. And like I said, the Anzacs suffered like over 50%. I think I calculated like 53% is what were either killed or wounded in the actual campaign. 35,000 about out of 65,000, which is pretty awful, you know. And so later what happens is it forces the British to give up. I think by the beginning of, I want to say 1916, the British withdraw. They withdraw from the actual peninsula. And they do think that part of why the Turks did well was the fact that they had gotten not just military equipment from the Germans, like machine guns and other kinds of weaponry, artillery, etc., but they also had these German advisors that helped the Turks out. There was this one man named Otto Lyman von Sanders that was involved in the war. And I don't think I've got a picture of him, but he was kind of instrumental. And then on the Turkish side, they had this general named Mustafa Kemal, who they called later Ataturk, which Ataturk, by the way, means father of Turkey. And he was considered the best general, really, on the Turkish side in the Gallipoli campaign. And after the war, if you know about this, after the Ottoman Empire broke up, he helped found the Republic of Turkey in 1923. I think he was later the first president of it. And so he's kind of considered like the father of modern Turkey we know today. But so, yeah, they couldn't defeat basically the Ottoman Empire at this point. But Ottoman Empire will not be defeated, of course, until later in the war in 1918. Now, they have, of course, another famous battle that was fought. And, of course, 1916 is very famous for these so-called bloody battles that were fought. Some people call them almost like stalemate battles, where neither side really win. They're kind of indecisive in the war, but they're very known for having a lot of casualties, like almost close to like 2 million in the war. The Battle of Verdun, of course, and the Battle of also the Somme as well. Battle of Verdun, if you know about this battle, is considered one of the longest battles in history, like one of the longest. It did last, I think, a total of like 302 days. 302 days, February to December 1916. Greatest, longest battle of World War One. It's not quite the bloodiest. It is considered one of the bloodiest, of course, in World War One. I want to say top three, I think, in the war overall. Both sides, which were mostly French versus the Germans, with some British fighting with the French, fought over like a 25-mile front in the northern part of France, where, of course, it took place on the frontier close to where Belgium is. And they fought around what is called the Meuse River, which was a river in northern France, which was heavily fortified by the French. Some of these fortifications went back actually to, I think, the 19th century, that had been built earlier there as well. And they fought like around several forts, which you can see there. I think that the three that they show in the map are Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux, and also Fort Souville. Yeah, those three forts, those are the ones that they fought for strategic control around the Meuse River. And the actual brainchild of this operation was this German general named Erich von Falkenhayn, who is like the head of the German chief of staff, the main general at the beginning of the war, that kind of fights the French and the British on the Western Front in 1916. And Falkenhayn was the one that made the famous statement that he was going to bleed France white at Verdun. And what he meant by that, he was going to try to use a war of attrition to wear down the French forces, try to kill more Frenchmen than Germans. I think he said that if he could kill 2 Frenchmen for 1 German, they could probably break through and take Paris at that point. And so the offensive was launched in February of 1916. Of course, one of the bloodiest battles, of course, in World War I. Of course, the bloodiest battle of all time is actually Battle of Stalingrad, which happened 1942 to 1943. Here's kind of a picture of this, which is interesting. There was only one road that actually went into where Verdun was on the French side, which was called the Voie Sacrée, which is the Sacred Way, it's called. And if the Germans would have taken that road, they probably would have been able to break through it, because that was their main supply artery going into Verdun, heavily fortified area. Here's kind of course, another map looking at Verdun, where the city of Verdun, which is around the Meuse River, you can see there, and then all the forts kind of to the east of it. And on the other side, on the French side, there was, of course, a famous general that was well known, of course, at Verdun in 1916, which was Philippe Pétain, so-called Lion of Verdun, they called him. And it was under his forces that they held the German forces back for many months. And Pétain was the one that popularized this motto that the French started using in 1916, which is "They shall not pass." And so if the Germans would have broken through at Verdun, the war probably would have been over, I think, pretty much in the West. So, but yeah, neither side was able really to do much. And so it was like a whole stalemate, but the German forces just gave up by the end of the year. Now, they did have another battle that also broke out. I did want to talk about besides the Battle of Verdun, which was called the Battle of the Somme, which broke out as the Battle of Verdun was going on. The Battle of the Somme, also called the Somme Offensive, took place in July to November of 1916. It was fought over a period of like 5-6 months at the end of the year. This was primarily a British counteroffensive that was fought in the Somme River Valley, which is north of Verdun. Some people think it was fought to relieve pressure on Verdun and force the Germans to put forces there as well. It was a very bloody battle. The Somme, they think, is considered one of the bloodiest battles of World War One. Over 3 million troops were involved in the Battle of the Somme. It appeared like 5-6 months. British with some French involved versus the Germans. They think the casualties on both sides combined was close to 1 million, so a little more than Verdun. I think Verdun may have been, it's kind of a debate about how many people were wounded and killed at Verdun, but it's 600,000 to 800,000, I think, may have been the range. And part of why the Allies were successful at the Somme, the British introduced a new weapon in the war, which was the tank. If you know about this, which is right there, they think tanks evolved from like probably tractors and things with treads on them. After they've been used like in farming and things like that before, agriculture. And they think it kind of helped to push the Germans back, but only a few miles. I think they joke about the fact that the Somme was called the Big Push because they pushed the Germans back 6 to 8 miles, something like that, in some areas along the front line. But both battles were considered really to be kind of inconclusive. Neither side really winning. The Somme is famous for one thing which the British want to forget about it. The Somme was the bloodiest battle in British history. Just in the first day, I think it's July 1st, is the day they had that many 57,000 casualties on the first day of the battle. Just one day, with over 19,000 being killed. A lot of them were mowed down by machine guns, artillery, etc. So a lot of young men were, killed at the beginning, of course, of these wars. But neither side were really able to win either way, and neither side will really break through. Like Allies eventually defeat Germany, but it won't be until 1918. So the war is really a war of attrition, stalemate, pretty much on the Western Front. There's a lot of discontent in a lot of the countries, like in France and Britain. They actually hold new elections, and they even elect new prime ministers. Like in Britain, David Lloyd George is elected prime minister. George Clemenceau is elected in France as prime minister as well. They'll kind of try to take control of the war. I think in the French armies, there was even a case where there was 1917 mutinies, and the French had to go and shoot a bunch of soldiers to put down mutinies and all that. And the Germans started doing more unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, and that really helped to also expand the war and get the United States, of course, involved as well. Now, one thing that does, like on the Western Front, a new general takes over, Paul von Hindenburg, who you see on the bottom left. He was really the greatest German general, really, in the war. And the Germans decide to form a new defensive line, which they began building between 1916 and 1917. They kind of push back a little bit and create more of a defensive position to fight the Allies. And they think because of that, that's part of why World War I lasted longer than really it should have in the war. I think there was a movie released a few years ago, if you want to see it, called 1917. I don't know if you've seen that or not. Came out a few years ago. Pretty good movie on World War I. But it kind of shows that. Now the Germans back up and, again, of course, using this new defensive line, of course, in the war. But like I said, both sides really were kind of almost exhausted at that point. And with the Americans later, that's going to help really to change the war. Now, I'm going to get to it later, not today. Probably won't have time today, but I'll talk about the Russian Revolution. 1917, the Russian Revolution is going to break out at the end of World War I. It's going to cause the collapse of the Russian Empire. That does cause the Russians to drop out of the war. So that kind of helps to change the war a little bit. Now I'll get to later how the Soviet Union forms after the Russian Civil War breaks out as well. And then later I'm going to talk about also, I'll get into how the United States gets in the war. Of course, we have, like I said, the Germans with their unrestricted submarine warfare, of course, sinking ships, killing Americans. Now I'll talk about the Zimmerman telegram. That was another thing, of course, that supposedly helped to get the United States involved, of course, in World War I as well. So anyway, before I go, I want to talk about some reminders about assignments. Don't forget, of course, those are the main assignments that are out right now. The bonus video quiz. Don't forget. I think I'm going to leave it open a little longer, a couple days, whatever. But if you want extra bonus points for that, try to get that wrapped up, of course, in Canvas quizzes. But the main thing y'all need to be working on right now is the second exam. A bunch of you are not doing the discussion questions too. You might want to do that too. I'll try to give you more bonus points for that. But that's something I need to work on because those are study guide questions y'all might need later or to turn in for bonus points. So that's it for today. Like I said, later in the week on Wednesday, I'll kind of continue. I'll talk about, of course, the end of World War I. And I'll also talk about the Treaty of Versailles. Now that's going to lead into the causes of World War II, rise of fascism, things like that, of course, between the wars. And so that's it for today. I hope y'all have a great week out there, by the way. Week 11. Only a few more weeks left, of course, of classes at BRCC. So y'all take care. I'll see you, of course, later in the week. So see y'all later. Bye. Take care.